This is the first event of August. I will talk about the other upcoming events at the end of today's program, but you are in for a monster treat today. And by monster, I don't mean actual monsters, I mean Karl. It's a figure of speech, if you will. He actually gave this presentation at one of our offsite retreats, and people walked away from the presentation buzzing. They were like, oh my gosh, you should do this as a membership event. And so that's exactly what's happening. Karl's doing this today as a membership event. Now, he's been doing a lot with our live cohort, so I've been giving him big introductions like for the last 2 weeks. It's really inflating his ego. So today I said he has to introduce himself. So I'm going to let Karl do that because this is awesome. As usual, we'll do like 40, 50 minutes of talk and then Q&A at the end. So give a big round of emoji applause or real applause or pretend applause or stand up and boogie for Karl Purcell, a Rational Labs behavioral scientist, coming to you live from San Diego. Take it away, Karl.
Thank you, Ryan. And you're right. Now that my ego is nice and inflated, I feel ready to introduce myself for a change. So I appreciate you picking me up all week long. It's been fantastic. Welcome, everybody. I'm really delighted to talk to you all today. Let's have a quick look at what we're going to cover real quick. So I'll do a little bit about who we are and more importantly, who I am. I'll give you some details of my background and my experience. We'll answer the question, well, why should we learn from game designers anyway? What makes them so great? Why should we pay attention to what they have to say? We'll answer the question, isn't this just gamification that was kind of popular in the 2000s? And spoiler alert, the answer there is going to be no. Then we'll have a look at 5 game design techniques that you really need to know if you want to improve your product or your service. And then I'll end with a couple of resources that help me put together this talk in case you're interested in learning a bit more. So I'm sure everyone knows, since you're at an Irrational Labs event, that we are Irrational Labs. And I'm sure you know that we are co-founded by Dan Ariely and Kristen Berman, and that our managing directors are Evelyn and Richard. And these are all leading thinkers in behavioral economics. And we've worked with a large number of kind of big names in the industry. So across big tech, Google, Intuit, Facebook, Lyft, Microsoft, and Uber. In health, big companies like Aetna, Ancestry.com, and the World Bank. And we've also worked with some government clients over time too. But I feel a little bit more qualified to tell you about who I am and what my experience is. So to give you a little bit of context, I'm originally from Ireland. So I moved to San Diego about a year ago. And when I was working in Ireland, I founded Ireland's first behavioral economics unit. So I worked in the central government and I was responsible for lots of different things. But one of the things that I did was completed Ireland's first randomized control trial in Ireland's Department of Labour, where we tried to improve the number of people attending job seeker sessions. I also led a team then after that in the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, so a team of 3 behavioural scientists, where we completed about 25 different policy experiments over a 4-year period. And if that wasn't enough, I was also involved advising the Irish government on COVID policy. So like I'm sure a lot of you had a very busy 2020 and 2021, doing things like running surveys, providing policy advice to government ministers, and designing experiments more generally to try and inform the Irish government's response to the COVID-19 crisis. But I guess today we're here to talk about game design. So maybe even more importantly, I should give you my gaming credentials. So if anyone ever played Gran Turismo, the driving simulator all the way back on PlayStation 1, I'll have you know I completed all of the A-grade licenses back in the day. Thankfully, I also have my real license and I don't rely on those when I'm out on the real roads. I won a totally not fake medal that you can see me holding up here for the highest Pac-Man score ever. Okay, so I didn't, but you know, I'm okay at Pac-Man, I'm pretty good. And I've been playing games kind of more generally for about 20 years, I would say. And I just have a real interest, not just in kind of playing games themselves, but also in the techniques that game designers use to get us to do different things. So whether that's to play more online, whether it's to take a certain route in a level, all of these things, game designers use really specific techniques to try and improve our experience. And that's what we're going to look at today. So why should we pay attention to game designers anyway, right? I'm a behavioral scientist. Why am I going off and reading a load of work by game designers? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. But the first is that game designers have this really unique and special opportunity where they have full control over the game environment. They basically get to play God, right? They can create levels in any way that they want. it's really easy for them to change things. So to change a path or to add an extra few gems to lead you to a different corridor, it's really easy to have full control over the environment. If anyone here ever played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, you probably remember that you were able to build your own skate parks, right? You could move ramps around, create your own levels. And this is what game designers do all the time. And it gives them a really unique ability to understand how changing the environment can change player behavior. And so I think it's really important that we try and learn from them, since in the real world, it can be a little tricky to go around changing the environment, the physical environment that we live in all of the time. Another reason is that game designers actually take measurement pretty seriously. So in game design, they have what's called telemetry. And this is basically data that allows game designers to track everything that a player is doing, when they're doing it, and where they're doing it within a game. And so I just took 2 screenshots from a talk that was about game design and telemetry. And what you're seeing here is from a first-person shooter, you're seeing, or sorry, from a kind of like a role-playing game where you can string combos together. You're seeing on the left where a large number of low combo moves happen. So in blue, what they're showing you is every time a player got a combo between 1 and 9 different hits. And on the right, what you're seeing is where players had really high combos. So where they're chaining more than 40 attacks together, right? Like really impressive stuff. But why is it so different? Why do we have so many low combos on the left and just a really tight cluster of high combos on the right? Well, when the game designers actually looked at this telemetry data, they could see that in all of the blue combos were happening, the low score combos, these were in narrow corridors where only a small number of enemies were present. So players simply didn't have the opportunity to string a large number of attacks together. There wasn't enough space, there wasn't enough enemies to do that. But when they changed the environment, when players got to a larger open arena style area with lots of different enemies to attack, they were actually able to string these massive combos together. And this tells the game designers something really important, right? If we want to design a game where the objective is to get a lot of high combos, because that could be really fun for the user, then we need to have more open spaces with large numbers of enemies. And another reason that I think we should pay attention is that actually game designers do a really good job of mirroring the real world, and including real things like incentives and status. And so what I'm showing you here are some graphs that are summarizing the economy of a game called EVE Online. And EVE Online, if you've never heard of it, is basically a game where you pilot starships and you can do lots of different things. You can go and mine asteroids for resources. You can become a space pirate and steal resources from other players. You can work for corporations, which is, admittedly doesn't sound super fun, right? But I assure you, lots of people play this and have a great time. But what's really interesting about this game is that there's so many players transacting with this in-game currency that if you look at this top graph, what you're actually seeing is the currency fluctuations for the in-game currency called the ISK. And it actually moves pretty closely to how a real-world currency moves. It changes in value in line with demand and supply, but it's not totally volatile like something like Bitcoin. It's actually relatively stable over time. And the game designers can change the value, like a central bank would, of the currency and see how that affects gameplay for players. And what you can see down the bottom is that players actually can join corporations, so they can either choose to be workers, so supplying their labor, or they can become a corporation and hire people themselves, creating demand for labor. And so these are all real things that happen in the real economy. And so the fact that this is happening in games tells us that, okay, if all of these real world things can be simulated in there, then actually there probably is something to learn by watching what people do in line with these kind of similar to real life incentives and status effects. And just to really put this point home, you might say, okay, Karl, that sounds great. There's an in-game currency, but so what? It doesn't mean anything. Well, actually, in EVE Online, people spend real money, real hard dollars on in-game resources. And in the largest battle that ever took place in this game, and you're seeing a really brief screenshot of that on the right here, there was over $378,000 of real damage done to players' ships. And what that means is that they have skin in the game, right? They're incentivized to act and make good decisions, to try and actually optimize their decisions. And so that tells us that when we look at gameplay behavior, we can kind of infer that they would do something similar in the real world, given that they would face similar incentives in the real world. So hopefully I've convinced you that game designers are pretty cool, that they know a lot, and that their environments are realistic enough that we can actually draw some general lessons about human behavior from them. And now let's address the gamification question. Isn't this just gamification that was super trendy in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s? Well, today what we're actually going to look at are some very different techniques. We're going to look at things like sandboxing, loading screens, a concept that I call power up to power down, breadcrumbing, and feedback and leaderboards. And we're going to look at how you can use that to drive real behavior change in your product. And the answer to the question is just simply flat no, right? It's not just gamification. These techniques that I just mentioned are not just gamification. Gamification kind of, if you remember that kind of big trend, as I said, towards the end of 2000s, in the 2010s, it was all about giving people non-monetary rewards, often things like badges, for doing things that you wanted them to do. So I use the Nike Running Club app a lot, and it gives me these kind of badges and rewards for doing things like running 5K, running 10K, and running on a Sunday when you really don't want to. And don't get me wrong, these things are useful. Like meta-analyses show that these type of non-monetary ways of kind of applying gamification to things like education and exercise can encourage people to study more and to run more and things like that. And that's great. But I think what the techniques that we're going to look at today have a lot more potential than just kind of giving people in-game non-monetary rewards. So without further ado, let's start jumping into these techniques. And we'll start first off with sandboxing. So sandboxing. What is sandboxing? Sandboxing is basically giving your players, or in the real world, giving your users a space where they can make decisions, but that they're safe from the consequences of those decisions. So they can kind of basically simulate, practice, and try out different things that would happen in the real world and see how things would really play out for them, but without being exposed to any of the risks. So let me give you a bit more of a concrete example, right? I'm sure you've probably been to a party recently where someone for like the 1,000th time is trying to convince you, hey, you should really get in on Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin's going to take off, you know? But you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, okay, maybe it is, but it's super risky. I hear it's pretty volatile and I don't really want to part with my hard-earned cash on a bit of a gamble. Well, sandboxes can be a nice way to let people try out something like this, try out a risky behavior like investing in Bitcoin without exposing themselves to the real dollar damage. And we'll come back to this example now in a minute when we look at how eToro does this really nicely. But this is really common in games. In games like League of Legends, they give players the ability to use practice tools or sandboxes to basically design and set up environments where they would face big challenges in the real game. So they could basically say, okay, I know I'm about to go into a level with some really high-powered enemies and with some really tricky turrets and stuff. Maybe I want to go and practice what that will actually pan out like if I use one strategy versus another. And this training tool allows them to do this in that safe environment while they can do things like turn on auto-generating health, they can turn off turrets on and off, all of these different things. And it lets them practice where they can get real feedback, right? It's very similar to what will happen when they go and do the real thing, but without any of the risk. They're not going to lose any of their real lives. They're not going to lose any of their high score, all of these things. And remember, I said we'd come back to eToro and Bitcoin. And eToro does this really, really nicely. So what they do is they say, okay, look, investing is kind of scary, especially if you're thinking about something as volatile as Bitcoin. How about we give you a free endowment of 100,000 virtual dollars, and you can put that on real stocks or in real Bitcoin investment and actually see what would happen. So we'll follow the actual market fluctuations that are happening every day, but you're only playing with this kind of 100,000 virtual dollars. And so therefore you're getting a chance to learn how your decisions would pan out if you were to actually do that without taking on the incredible risk of putting $100,000 of your own money into something like Bitcoin. So hopefully that makes sense there. I should say I'm happy to take questions as well as we go. If anyone has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. I'm just going to check it here now. Okay. If you do have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I will answer them as we go. And of course, we'll have time for some Q&A at the end too. I see a question coming in. Oh, it's Ryan with a helpful reminder. Okay, we'll keep going for now. So the second design principle that I'd like to talk to you about is using loading screens effectively. right? So loading kind of sucks, generally speaking, right? When we're playing a game, all we want to do is get to the level. If we're waiting for our Facebook feed to load, or if we're using some new piece of software, all we want to do is get in and use the thing that we actually want to use. But they also offer us an opportunity to take advantage of kind of some really focused attention that our users have, because they're looking at the screen, waiting for the loading process to finish. And Clash of Clans, this kind of mobile game, it's a tower defense game where you set up walls and turrets and stuff to keep enemies away. They do a really nice thing with their loading screen. They use the loading screen as an opportunity to give tips to players while they're waiting. So they say things like, upgrade your walls to slow down the enemy. And that's a tip that the player can use straight away, right in the next level, right as it comes up. And this is a tip that real designers of products and services can use too. So if we look at how Uber uses this, Uber knows, right, that you're not going to really enjoy the process of waiting for your Uber to show up, but they use it as a key opportunity to show how hard they're working for you, right? They're showing you here your estimated arrival time is 11:18 a.m. And if you click on that, if you click the little information button, it actually gives you a bit of a breakdown on how they calculate your arrival time. And what's really good about that is they're being transparent about the amount of effort that they put into to giving you an accurate time estimate. And that makes you trust the app a little bit more, makes you feel a little bit more confident that you're ready to wait a little bit longer for an Uber, knowing that that time is actually pretty accurate, which is great. And Slack uses the loading screen as a place to offer tips as well. They do things like, hey, if you want to try out new sidebar colors, you can click your workspace name, then preferences, sidebar, and team, and go in and change them. So it's a great time to take advantage of the focused attention that your users have on your app as they're waiting for it to load, and either use it to reinforce how hard you're working for them, or to give them useful tips where they'll get even more value out of the piece of software, the tool, or the product that they're using. I see a question in the chat. Loading screens are like the equivalent of lines or times. Do you have examples of those times being used, like waiting times? Oh, excellent. Yes, I was just in Disneyland recently, and they are the absolute masters of this. So I don't want to say too much about the new Star Wars rides, because I'll spoil it for anyone who hasn't been on them yet, and they're absolutely amazing. But Disney has learned over time that waiting kind of sucks, right? You're in this massive line. It's 40 minutes, 50 minutes sometimes, especially for these newer, more popular rides. And you're in California, so it's pretty hot, right? So it's not always the most enjoyable thing. But what they do is they actually turn the waiting line into an experience itself. So when you go to these new Star Wars attractions, as you queue, they have loads of kind of real, or what should I say, they have loads of props from the movies that you can kind of touch and play with, and they have costumes there that you can look at the intricate details. You can kind of get real up close and personal with that you usually wouldn't be able to. And they also play messages over the intercoms from time to time. So they basically have characters playing out a script like, oh no, the base is under attack, and things like this. So it's keeping you immersed in the experience all the time, and actually turning the wait line into part of the experience itself. And there's actually another even better example from the Star Wars ride, but I really don't want to spoil it from anyone. So anyone who knows the Star Wars ride, the new one, they'll know what I'm talking about. But great question. Thank you very much. If anyone else has questions, feel free to pop them in. We're going to look now at the third principle. This is something I call power up to power down. And you see this all of the time in games. So I don't know if anyone here played Metroid Prime. It was a game for the Nintendo 64 all the way back in kind of the 90s, I think it was, the mid 90s. And you play as this character, Samus. She is a woman who has this battle suit and has these incredible abilities. She has a rocket cannon on her arm. She can turn into a ball that rolls around. She can jump super high. Pretty awesome stuff. And what they do at the start of this game is really clever. You start the first level with every single ability that you're going to have through the rest by the end of the game. So you start off with a rocket cannon, you start off with this ability to jump really high, turn into a ball, all of these cool things. And at the end of that level, you're attacked, and all of your really cool equipment, like your rocket cannon, is actually taken from you. Trust me, there is no pain harsher than losing your rocket cannon right at the end of a level after you realize just how cool it is. And so what's really nice about this is you have this motivation to keep playing then, right? You know all of these cool abilities that you're going to be able to get, and you're motivated to explore the game world to get them back as you keep moving. And other games do this really well. So another game that does this really well is a game called Fruit Ninja, where you're swiping to try and destroy fruit on the screen, but bombs can appear on the screen. And if they do, and if they explode, you lose a life. And so at the start of Fruit Ninja, they give you 3 bomb deflects, which allow you to just basically click a button and clear your screen of all the bombs. Super powerful, super useful. And this is super important, right? What the game designer is doing is they're showing you just how powerful this extra tool is, this bomb deflect tool. And that is helping the player understand just how valuable it is. And when they run out after they use their first 3, then they'll be more likely to go back to the into the in-app purchase store and make a purchase of bomb deflects, because they know how useful they are and they've used them already. So they've taken advantage of what we call in the behavioral science literature the endowment effect, where someone values something more because they already own it or have owned it, to increase the value that people put on these things like bomb deflects. So some tips about how you can do this if you're designing a product or a service. You can basically do things like providing a limited number of free samples or uses. That's super useful. You can provide time-limited access to powerful or premium features. You see this a lot, especially for software. You can allow users to try your premium features in a sandbox environment. So again, using a sandbox environment where they can test things out, see how it would work, but they necessarily can't apply it in the real world yet. And also you can allow users to try premium features without saving or downloading the results. And the example that I've taken here is actually a guitar amp plugin from one of my favorite guitarists, this guy called Corey Wong. And he created this amazing piece of software that allows you to replicate his sound basically identically by just plugging your guitar into a computer and using this plugin, right? Like, think about that the amount of work that he's probably had to put in terms of replicating the sound of vintage amps, of vintage guitars, all of these things. But he gives this thing away for free for 14 days. He says, hey, you can download this, you can use it for 14 days. If you want to use it on a real song during your 14-day period, that's it, absolutely fine. Confident in the fact that it's such a useful and powerful tool that once people have had the chance to actually use it, they're likely to upgrade to premium to want to hang on to it forever. I see we have some stuff in the chat. Let me check that. I see many examples of where it's seen as a time to advertise or upsell. This is incredibly frustrating. The companies have experienced that approach is effective. Good question, Rick. It's a good point, right? You want to strike a balance between giving them tips that are useful and that they actually want. So one example is where we worked with Microsoft before on this. And with Microsoft, we did some work where we tested whether or not people would want tips if we were able to give them more useful tips if they could choose them. So they could basically self-select and say, oh, I want tips about things like how to use Word more effectively, or I want a tip about how to use Excel more effectively. And when users were able to self-select we saw that they were much more likely to use tips and to pay attention to them and remember them later on in our experiment. So yeah, you want to make sure that it's something that's actually useful and meaningful to the user. And one really smart or clever way of doing that is actually allow them to choose the topic on which you'll give them tips about. But great question, Rick. Eric, do you know any game or app that are customizable per the behavior I want to incentivize? I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, Eric, so we'll come back to that towards the end for the Q&A. Okay, great. So we'll come back to some of those now as we get towards the Q&A. Design principle 4 that we're going to look at is an idea called breadcrumbing. And to illustrate this a bit more powerfully, does anyone remember the story of Hansel and Gretel, where an evil witch lures them into lunch, or at least into potentially becoming lunch? And if you remember, Hansel and Gretel escape because Hansel is very smart and he's left a trail of breadcrumbs all the way through the forest that they can follow to escape. Well, game designers are pretty smart too, and they use this technique all the time. This idea of breadcrumbing is where you leave really clear indicators like gems lying around the game environment that encourage users to go in a certain direction and give them rewards when they actually do that. So in Spyro the Dragon, again, an absolute classic from PlayStation 1 back in the 90s, you can see here that they want you to go to this return home portal, and they've put gems around the side to get you to go around in that direction, and then a big gem that's worth 10 points in the portal itself to make you jump in there. And so this is a really nice way to lead users through your product, right? Lyft does this incredibly well. So Lyft uses this technique when they were introducing new products and services within the app. So they started offering rentals where you could rent a car through the Lyft app. And what you're seeing here is a little purple indicator, right? A little kind of, hey, what's that? Maybe I want to check out what that is. And a pop-up notification that was overlaid saying introducing rentals. And then they do something even more clever. Once you click on that and go to the page on the right, they're offering you a $30 reward, right? A $30 off your first rental. And that's basically a reward for exploring, right? If you hadn't clicked in there, you wouldn't see this $30 off. So they're setting up a mental model for their users that, hey, when we introduce new services and products, or when we do new things in the app, if you explore them and consider using them, we're going to reward you. And that's setting up a good positive feedback loop where people want to explore the app and potentially use more of your services. So breadcrumbing is a really powerful way to guide your users through your product or your service or your piece of software and get them to go where you'd like them to go. I see we have another question in the chat, I think. Is usage of a free trial always the best predictor of conversion to purchase? That's a good question. I don't know actually off the top of my head, Adam, to be totally honest. I would imagine that you could have some other proxies. So not just do they download the free trial and use it, but how do they use it? So for example, do they download it and start using the features very intensely? Do they download it and use a lot of different features? They might be better indicators that someone is getting a lot of value out of your free trial and that they might consider upgrading to premium, but it's a good question. Okay, we're on to the final principle. This is the concept of feedback and leaderboards, right? We all like to be at the top of leaderboards, and we all like it when we get really clear feedback about our performance, especially in games. This is one of the reasons I think that we play games, right? Is we get really quick feedback on our skill and whether we're doing things right and how good we compare to others. This is kind of maybe some of the secret sauce that was behind Wordle's success. Do you remember at the start when Wordle was going around on social media, there was all these boxes, right, on everyone's social media feed of like a gray box, a yellow box, a green box, showing you how quickly they were getting the word correctly. Were they getting it in 1 go, 2 goes, 3 goes? And this is really useful, right? It's a kind of way that you can compare yourself to others and to yourself over time and notice that you're getting better at it. And that is really kind of something that people love doing. It's something that people will chase, is that feeling of, hey, I'm actually getting a little bit better over time. I can see my progress that I'm making. This is awesome. I want to do some more of this. Strava do this incredibly well. If you do any sort of kind of running or biking or any sort of exercise, I really encourage you to download Strava and consider using it. So they have lots of different features where they give users both feedback on how they're performing over time, but they also use leaderboards to motivate you to work even harder. So you can see here that we have some leaderboards for cycling, and you can see that we're getting things like how far people are cycling, how quickly. And this is a real strong motivator for people to actually want to beat these records and see themselves move up through that leaderboard. And another example of this and how they do it well is when they're giving feedback. It's sometimes I see this a lot. People will say, oh, you opened our app 3 times today. And the user's left thinking, okay, is that good? Is that bad? Like, is 3 too little, too many? You know, is that helping me get towards the key behavior that I really want to do, like exercise? What Strava does is they contextualize every piece of information that they give you. So when they're telling you that your weekly effort is 50 or 60, they contextualize by saying, look, that's actually lower than your average, or it's higher than your average, or it's right on the money of your 3-week average. And that helps you build a much clearer picture in your head of, are you improving over time? So it's not just giving feedback, it's giving clear feedback that's really impactful for users. I see we might have another question here. When giving feedback, is adding tips on how to improve your stats more effective than feedback only? Yes, absolutely. It's also very important to make it really clear to people how they can improve. So for example, if we're talking about running, right? It's useful to tell me that I'm getting slower and say, hey, you know, you might need to increase your training, but it's also even more useful if you give me specific advice on how to do that right there and then. So you might say something like, you know, actually you need to do some interval training we're going to give you an interval training plan for Tuesday and Thursday. Do you want to opt in? That it would absolutely make it more likely that the person will follow through and actually do some of that stuff. A great question. Thank you very much. So I think that's basically what I wanted to cover today. And just to say that, you know, as Irrational Labs and all the work that we do, we try and pull in insights from lots of different areas, psychology, behavioral science, and obviously game design, and infuse this into all of the different ways that we help organizations. So whether that's doing innovation design, where we're helping design new programs and products from the ground up, whether it's improving existing stuff, where we're improving engagement with existing products and programs, or if you're trying to incorporate behavioral design into the DNA of your organization, we really take all of these insights and apply it across all of these things that we do. I'll leave this up in a minute for getting in touch. And just to say that when these slides are shared, there's also some resources. So if you're super interested in this topic of game design, I've just given some links to some online talks and some books if you want to explore more. But thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy now to take some questions.
So Karl, before we go to Q&A, I want to point out that you crushed the membership leaderboard because you were the #1 talk on behavioral science and game design today.
Ego was going up and then down.
I tried. So yeah, who has questions for Karl? I'm sure there are many. And I do just want to say, Karl, as I did not see this talk when you did it at the retreat, I was probably one of the serious working groups, you know. No, but it's brilliant how you distilled those 5 key takeaways. And I love the difference between gamification and thinking in terms of psychology and behavioral design. I mean, I thought that was a brilliant parsing and distillation. I'm sure others agree, but who has questions for Karl?
I see, oh, Sharon has her hand up.
Oh, Sharon is always good for a good question. Sharon in Seattle, bring us a good question.
So I'm fascinated by the idea of sandbox. And I started to think about how so many problems I'm solving would be great to have a sandbox. And we've been talking about psychological safety with clients. And are there other sandbox programs outside of gaming that could simulate real life situations? Well, I should say business situations.
Absolutely, yes. I think there are. So there was the example I gave of eToro, of course, for people who want to practice doing trading. But there's other examples too. So when I was in business school, for example, they were trying to teach us, you know, different lessons about how you manage a business in the real world. And instead of teaching us theory, what they did was they gave us basically a simulation of an airline. And myself and all of my classmates were basically put into this giant simulation where we all had to run competing airlines week to week and make decisions about, am I going to increase the number of routes? But that's going to increase my operating costs. Like, is there enough profit in that? Can I change out a different type of plane to try and reduce my overheads? All of these things. There's lots of different simulation products that are out there that can help with things like training, or even just where people need to learn. So even some software tools do this really well, where they'll teach you how to use them by giving you an interactive sandbox environment where you're completing a task. So for example, imagine I wanted to teach you Photoshop. It would be awesome if they just gave you a kind of a really basic simplified version, a sandbox version of Photoshop with just the key tools you're going to need to do like the 5 major things, right? So like masking, contrast, whatever it is. And then they gave you an interactive tutorial to go through it. So there's lots of opportunities to give people little sandboxes where they can play around safely and learn how things work. I think so.
Yeah, and I just shared in the chat. There are, so the University of Michigan, actually, I've read about this. They have this software called Viewpoint, and it's just that. It's basically a virtual sandbox to do decision making in a variety of settings. So to Karl's point, I know there are other offerings. I just happened to catch that one in our alumni magazine. So people are working on making these types of things that are inspired by these video game concepts. Other questions?
If anyone has any questions about like how to apply this to what you're working on or a product or service that you offer, also happy to take those.
Adam has actually a comment. Adam, you want to come forth?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, that was kind of an add-on, but maybe I'll take a twofer.
Yeah.
The first one was with sandboxing. I just wondered if there's a time and a place for sandboxing, because I know, for example, when the company that manages my company's 401k program, when they give me a sandbox, I always feel like, oh yeah, this is not going to be how things work out at all, because they have, their motivations are suspect in the sandbox they've given me to play with. So I wonder if there's, some guidelines around when you would deploy sandboxing versus something else. When you're trying to convince people of something, it seems like it's a less pure environment, I guess, for a sandbox. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that speaks to like a broader point about trust in general, right? And why it's so important to build trust between your company and your users. So I can understand where you might be coming from, right? So you're thinking they have a financial incentive to show me that I'm excellent at investing in the sandbox, but then when I get to the real world, maybe it doesn't pan out like that. So actually, eToro is a really good example of this. When you use that virtual currency, it tracks literally what would happen exactly if you did it with real money. And so that's one way that you can kind of increase trust, is say, look, it's not just a simulation. It's not just like, where we've set everything to be nice and everything's come out rosy. We're actually giving you the ability to try something safely where things are tracking exactly as they would happen if you were to do this for real. So that's one way to be a bit more transparent and take away some of that kind of questionable incentive practice, maybe. And
then, if you don't mind, can I follow up on my first question around free trials? Mm-hmm. So I work in automotive. I work for Ford Motor Company, mm-hmm. And there's some, I don't know what the right word is. There's a lot of storytelling going on in-house that by offering free trials to connected features and by tracking the usage of those features, that can be a strong predictor, because we know, this is just sort of in-house industry knowledge, that there's a big change in mindset and worldview that happens when you try some of these features versus when you're just thinking about them. So based on that, people are saying, well, if they try them and they show that they're engaged with the feature, that they will want to purchase it in the future. And this is things like in-vehicle video and stuff like that previously hadn't been available. I'm not talking about like BMW trying to monetize heated seats, the different thing. Right. But my question is, like, there are a lot of folks out there that just want to suck all the marrow out of any free trial given to them, and they really have no intention of paying. Whereas you may have other folks who are tentative users, but are genuinely interested and may be willing to take out their wallet. I'm just trying to figure out, is there a way for me to find those confounding variables or other things that may be more indicative of willingness to purchase, and not just like, well, they're using it a lot, therefore that's our customer?
Yeah, great question. I would say that this is like the perfect opportunity for an experiment, especially where if you know what the costs and the benefits are. So the costs are, I imagine, right, these free users who have no intention of converting. And so if they're using products or features that are super expensive, so let me try and think of an example. So for example, imagine you were giving them some sort of like ability for roadside assistance, right, which could be really expensive if they actually did use it. If you're seeing that, if you run an experiment, what you'll be able to know is, okay, yes, there's always going to be some people who just want to use the free trial while it's free, just to take advantage of it. But the question that you really want to answer is the marginal gain that I get from the people who do convert, who wouldn't have otherwise converted if we didn't give them a free trial, does that outweigh those kind of free riders and the costs associated with them? So I think if you can get a really clear picture of the costs of the users that don't ever convert, and if you also run a really clean experiment and understand exactly how many extra people signed up because you offered a free trial, you can simply just do a cost benefit and say, does this wash out? Is it actually in our benefit to do it?
Right. I'm actually designing an experiment like that right now. So maybe if I could grab some time with you in the near future. I don't know if you're up for something like that, but I'd love to chat a little more.
Sure, absolutely. Ryan can help coordinate that for sure.
Yes, I'm the matchmaker, definitely. Tiziana, you have a bunch of questions. Come on down and share your questions.
And then we'll go to Karen after that.
Oh, cool. And before I forget, Adam, send me an email. Just send me an email that's like Ryan plus Karl, and then I'll take it from there.
Sorry. Oh, hi, Karl. Thank you so much for the talk. I really loved it. So yeah, I had actually a question about the sandboxing and free trial and things like that. So my question, it's kind of a two-part question. So a sandbox, and that goes also maybe with the free trial or things like that. Do you think it would be more effective if I can keep something from it? So basically, like you were mentioning, you can try all the, great feature, but you can't save it. So do you think it would be, because I'm feeling that if you go to a sandbox just to play around, but you don't get anything out of it, it feels to me it's kind of a waste of time. I rather learn as I use the product. You know what I'm saying? And obviously we're not talking about expensive stuff like money or whatever, but I'm wondering having the chance to save a little bit would be maybe more beneficial. And kind of the second part, it would be, what do you think about the difference between a free trial and a stripped down free version as far as conversion is concerned?
Okay, great. So let's take the first question first. So I would say it really depends on your product, right? And it depends kind of, is this like a one-use product? Because then you definitely don't want to give them everything and have the ability to save everything because they'll never come back.
Sure.
But like, take the example that I was talking about, right? The plug-in for the guitar. Like 14 days is definitely enough time to download that plugin and like do all of the guitars on an album if you wanted. Like if you knew what you were going to play and everything, it's enough to do that. But I guess in that particular instance, and all of this, the real answer really is it's always worth an experiment to figure out. But if you've got a product like that where it's a long-term tool that someone's going to go back to and use over and over again, so whether it's a guitar plugin or a piece of software like Photoshop, if people go in and get a chance to really use it, and as you say, take something out like a guitar track or a perfectly edited photo, they're seeing the benefit, they're seeing the value, and that probably is going to make them more likely. But I would say it's an experiment to run.
Okay.
And then your second question about free trial or stripped down, that's a simple one. That's an experiment. I think you don't know until you test. And but this is going to be totally product dependent. So I would say you'd want to run an experiment there.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Beard, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Karl. I'm working on developing interventions or strategies to get people who smoke to be more engaged in our tobacco cessation classes. And so all of this is new to me. And so I was just wondering, of the 5 strategies that you shared with us this morning, which one would you think would be most appropriate for us to begin with?
Very interesting question. Let me think. Can I even remember all 5 again? So it was breadcrumbing. There was feedback and leaderboards.
Right.
We had
simulation.
Yeah. I don't know if actually any of those are things that I would pick as my first go-to for smoking. I know this is like a really well-researched area. So there's many studies out there already on kind of what works for getting people to go to smoking cessation programs. And so my gut would be to go there first. So I'm sure you're well aware, but there's the Cochrane reviews, or the Cochrane reviews, apologies if I pronounce his name wrong. And they have meta-analyses that look at the broad range of evidence about what works for smoking cessation programs. So I don't know enough about smoking cessation to say without having a look at those studies first, but that would be my go-to, is go to the Cochrane reviews and have a look and see what the evidence is pointing towards. I'll send Ryan a link and he can make sure that you get it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, let's see. NG. Oh, Natalie. I just saw the NG. Natalia, come on down. Give us your question.
Well, just thinking about loading screens, which is the moment of having this sort of like hyper-focused time, I think that could be misused by companies. So, I would like to think about either kind of the ethics around it or some like rules of thumb that could be used to make sure that you're actually providing value as opposed to taking away. I put the example of airlines, which really frustrates me when you're sitting there and they have the entire airspace and they're selling you their credit card. Like, it seems unfair, like there should be a rule against that, right? So I think of loading screens as a potential problem there too.
Totally. It's like a lot of things in behavioral science, it's how you use it and what you use it for, right? Whether it's kind of, if you like, ethical, or if it's going to be something that builds trust or harms trust. And I think I was talking about this earlier on, the Microsoft example. Like, if you can allow people to choose what tips they're going to see, then at least they're opting into that. But
Right.
yeah, you want to be conscious about that, right? You want to think, is this something that's actually in their interest? So am I giving a tip? And some upsells sometimes are in the consumer's interest, right? So imagine you're, again, a Photoshop user, right? And Photoshop, just like game designers, have telemetry data. They know how you're using their product, right? They can aggregate across thousands of people and see what features are most useful. So if Adobe are smart, what they should be doing is, if they're going to use the loading screen as an opportunity for an upsell, at least make it relevant to me. So for example, if I'm someone who does a lot of work with background image manipulation, I take trees out a lot or whatever, then they should offer me something that's at least relevant and say, hey, by the way, we have an amazing tool for people who do a lot of background image manipulation like you. Would you like to check it out? But yes, you do need to be careful and consider it and think, am I just taking advantage of a captive audience here, and is that going to annoy my customer? For sure.
Oh, let's see. Other questions? Otherwise, I will go to preview our August events.
There
I've
was,
got one more.
Oh, yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm hogging the mic.
No.
So are there any examples you can think of, Karl, where these sort of techniques, I forget, are we calling it gamification or are we not? If it's not gamification, what the things you were talking about can help nudge people towards engaging with a brand or sector that they usually wouldn't? You know, some unsexy sector or brand that, thanks to the way we engaged the user, now they like spend time on the site or spend more time in front of branded, assets. I'm just thinking if there are examples like that, it might be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. 100%. Like you see this a lot of the time. So to use a really kind of just like funny example, do you remember like in the late 90s, early 2000s, where cereal companies just started creating PC games for basically no reason? Like that was a total marketing tactic. They literally created games with like Tony the Tiger in them and stuff, just to basically get people to check out their product. It was kind of a crazy marketing strategy. Like, a lot of work goes into developing a game. But on a more serious way, I think, yeah, like if you've ever been to like a conference or like a more like kind of like like a seller's exhibit, like a big event where everyone's selling their wares kind of thing, like where are the stands that most people are? Usually where there's a challenge or where there's a chance to win something or something like that. So for example, we used, in the company I worked for in Ireland, we used to run an energy show every year, and the busiest stand every single year was a stand where they had 2 bikes hooked up to an electricity meter, and they had people compete to see who could generate the most electricity by cycling in a minute. And that was the busiest stand by far, right? And no one wants to talk to an energy company usually. If someone knocks on your door and says, hey, you want to talk about changing your energy bill? You're like, get away from me. Absolutely not. Sounds super boring. But just by gamifying it, by having this kind of competition element on the bikes, people are at the stand interacting with people. So absolutely, it can be a way to get people interested in something that otherwise they wouldn't be.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Awesome. Adam, since your screen wasn't on, I thought it was you, but I was having a Zoom moment where I was like, wait, is that Adam? Where is he? It was very funny. But I found
we have a new puppy, and it's kind of a crazy house right now.
no excuses. You and the puppy excuse. Is this what you've got, Adam? Come on.
Hey, my B game.
Adam's about 50 minutes north of me. He's in another Chicago suburb. So, okay. So Prashant and then Sharon.
Thank you so much for the talk. So the question I had was, would you use any of these techniques for social good activities? For example, like, planting more trees, recycling, encouraging recycling, like any, and how do you do that? Like, do you have any examples that have worked in the past? Because I remember a project at school wherein we used to think about, like, if we tell others in a specific area how much they generally recycle, proofing was an example of encouraging good behaviors. But I don't know whether there's something that is out there that actually does that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Definitely. You see this actually a lot in environmental work. So the entire kind of citizen science movement is kind of predicated on this idea that like you can get people to help do things like document habitat loss if you make it fun, right? So they have these apps where you can go around and take pictures of different plants, and you can get rewards for, you know, being the biggest plant collector in your area, so to speak. And it also identifies the plant. So it's kind of like, it gamifies into it by turning it into like a bit of, you know, see how much of your local area you can explore and find these new plants. But at the same time, you're actually helping researchers document habitat loss. Real like kind of physical environment changes that are a little bit more basic, but that you see a lot are simple things like if you want people to recycle more, you can put like a basketball net around the top of the recycling can, so people want to actually throw their stuff in. It's a little bit more fun, and thankfully if they're recycling the right thing, usually it's dry waste anyway, so it's not going to mess up the place. But yes, there are lots of examples like that where you can use these techniques to encourage social good, I think.
I'm desperately trying to find this article as we talk, but I think the Wall Street Journal did a big feature on trash teams. So like competitive garbage picking up is a big thing. And what they found actually, I think they did it by weight. So the really good teams would figure out you need to find the really big, like the rusted out tractor. Like if you go find that and you bring it in, like you're automatically going to destroy everybody that was picking up beer bottles and plastic cups. Hopefully I'll find it before Karl's done, but an extreme example to be sure. Sharon.
Okay, and just as an aside, we had cheaters in our trash picking competition who went to a garbage can and emptied it into their box and won using already picked garbage. So that was funny, but it's very fun, actually. It makes trash picking fun. My separate question was, I remember actually hearing or maybe being advised by one of the Irrational Labs teams that leaderboards don't often work. And I wondered, I'm trying to remember the context for that, but I wanted to find out if you knew of any conditions in which you shouldn't use a leaderboard, in which they're not effective, because I've tended to use those a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think leaderboards are most effective when it's easy for people to move up and down them, when they are public, and when the behavior is something that is, let's say, people want to be shared in public. So for example, one where it might backfire, for example, is a weight loss leaderboard, right? No one likes having their weight displayed very publicly. And so that could cause people to drop out of a program because they're like, hey, I don't want to see my weight written up in front of everyone else's every single week. So yeah, there definitely is. You want to have some handicapping as well. So I used to work in the energy space a lot. And energy competitions are actually one way that's kind of proven that can get businesses to save energy. So if you have like different teams within the company compete against each other on how much energy they can save over a given time period. But what you need to do is regularly reset and have handicaps throughout the period. So imagine you're doing a competition for 6 weeks. You want to reset the baseline every week. So imagine in week one team just goes so far out in the lead, and then everyone would just become demotivated. So that's why you need to kind of do a reset in week 2 and week 3. And also sometimes you might need to handicap it. So for example, imagine again that we're doing the energy saving competition and one team works on a production line. They have a huge opportunity to save energy, and another works in the office. They have a much less opportunity to save energy. If you want them to actually really compete, and for that to be fair, you'll need to come up with some sort of weighting to give a fair handicap towards the team that has less opportunity to save in the first place. So there are kind of some conditions under when it doesn't work and some things you can do to make sure that you don't run into those issues.
That's great. I especially like the handicap idea.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's super effective.
I saw I was muted, which is a good thing. As we wrap up today, remember this was our first August event. Karl, Purcell, make it fun using game design ideas to change your behavior. So briefly, emoji round of applause for Karl, or real round of applause, or dances because you're like, oh, I'm remote working and having so much fun. But what else is happening this month, you ask? Next week, we have office hours with Colin, Dr. West. So he will be available to talk about whatever. These are always very rich and interesting. And apologies, last month's office hours went sideways for all kinds of bizarre technical reasons, and we moved it over to Gmeet in Slack. So this should be good. It's all set up and good to go. This event we're actually going to open up because the University of Pennsylvania team will be promoting it heavily. But thinking about a behavioral science degree. So one of our own behavioral scientists, Daniela, will be bringing a team from UPenn together to talk about their program and what people did after they did a master's in behavioral science. And then our open event, if you don't know about Phil Agnew, he is a senior product marketer at Buffer, but most importantly, he's the host of the Nudge Forecast or the Nudge podcast. I clearly need to drink something. I don't know what's going on. Okay, more better. Host of the Nudge podcast. So if you haven't listened to it, it's very fun. And they're half hours, and he has great email. So, oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm a frog. But anyways, so that's what's coming up for August. So please come and join us. You have calendar events for 3 of the 4 things. The open event we're still setting up. So we look forward to seeing you. We'll announce stuff on Slack. And again, I'll put it in the chat one more time, but we do have all the membership things shared at the playlist. This particular PDF, we will share over at the Slack and announcements probably early next week. So again, all the recordings live over there in the chat. Thank you everybody for coming today. And a special thanks, Karl, for really wonderful insights, really distillation of a lot of thinking. Clearly too much time at the Game Council, Karl. In fact, I wonder, Karl, do you have an addiction? If so, Dr. Beard, can you help Karl? All right. Well, it's great to see everybody. We'll catch you all hopefully next week. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Karl.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you, everybody.